I think it's a provable. It's an extremely strong hypothesis that anything existing in a relationship of power to a subordinate or superordinate power, even the person on the lower end of this, if you're in a power disparity, asymmetry with another structure, there is a point at which you realize that withholding as much information as you can is in your interests.
It's like Foucault talks about sort of knowledge power. So it's kind of certain truth claims that are actually, constructed in a important sense, and certainly are, you could compare them between different historical periods and just say, yeah, this wouldn't even make sense in this. Yeah. So he referred to them as epistemes, like, which is more like the kind of underpinnings under which sort of different knowledge claims could even be conceivable.
This is the Panopticast. Conversations at the edge of freedom.
Everything that gets used as a tool against criminals and foreigners ends up getting used on the domestic population, and so they sort of normalise it, and obviously that's it links to the sort of state of exception stuff, because it is exceptional. We're using it on dangerous elements like criminals in the population, tagging and tracking and so on, or a lot of often techniques that have been used in colonial relations, which makes it even more, I think that is slightly more sort of interesting and profound, in that, the techniques that we used in foreign occupations are then repurposed and used on domestic populations.
I think you could go, you could get a lot of value out of looking at trying to create not a hierarchy, but a kind of a trajectory, staged trajectory of how that happens, different groups. In the furthest out and most acceptable is the clear and present threat from another country. So like if you had literally a poisonous ideology, or whatever, Nazis or whatever, right, that is as close to an objective negative, actual inherent evil, if you like. And then even that you can build a case for different cultural viewpoints, and what's the where does it, what is the basis of a national boundary, and what can people do behind that boundary, and what do we not have a right to interfere with, even if they're compromising other people's human rights by our definition, and all that shit. So there's even a conversation when you're at the Hitler level, right? And then it comes forward to like kind of intangible and slightly sort of airy threats from overseas and then threats that are subsidised or otherwise maintained by our own government, like everything obviously with like Al Qaeda and things like that. There's always, even if you take a very, very mundane, conservative view of what Al Qaeda was, no one can possibly question that there was some level of interaction between CIA and Al Qaeda, right? So then there's those people, and what we're going to do to defend against them. And then it creeps forward until the boundary gets crossed into, like what you're saying, into it becomes a domestic. It's like the crosshairs that were on the enemy outside and now on the enemy within. And that then is usually, it's like terrorists. That's what we've had in the narratives that we're used to, terrorists, and now with the COVID thing, obviously it's that unclean enemy within. And then the area that I think is most interesting though is where it crosses over from something that can lead to an exhausting conversation about, like if you're going to debate whether people who haven't had the vaccine are a threat to society, it's a horrible, exhausting conversation, because there's so much science involved, and quite deep moral, ethical positions that are themselves debatable. So it's just a mess, it's a quagmire to get involved in, right? Not that you shouldn't have the conversation, but that's why I think the most fruitful ways that conversation can be had is when it pushes past that even, and you get into the zone where it becomes very difficult, where this is just a citizen with a viewpoint that doesn't harm anyone, and yet they are being brought to heel kind of thing. And I think a lot of the places that a lot of places you get that is when there's, I think, just shooting from the hip a minute, I think the way, the line at which that you cross from that zone into the new zone, the further zone, is when people who are innocent by definition of all the pre-existing cultural norms of the society, who are having their freedom impinged upon as a result of emerging cultural norms. So like probably a good example of this would be like it would be people with an alternative just in the simplest sense, lifestyle, being flagged by social services. So like as a person who homeschools my kids, I can be flagged by social services. There's nothing illegal about that. They can put a mark next to my name and say, this is a person who exists within a certain risk category that we have identified, not because there's any legal framework for that, or there's anything wrong with homeschooling, home educating, but because we decide that by nature of that lifestyle choice, this is a person that on purely just opinion, we believe they might be trying to keep their kids out of the school. There's no framework for that. There's no science been done. There's no research. It's purely a leaning of the collective, and then these people are trying to extricate themselves from the collective to any degree whatsoever. On the basis of that, we can now flag this person, and they're not prevented from doing that if they don't vaccinate, whatever the reasons are, or to the degree to which they don't vaccinate, purely because they're concerned about one given vaccine. It could be just one vaccine that they've got concerns about that is completely science-based. They can be flagged for that. So you can end up getting someone who homeschools, don't vaccinate, and maybe, I don't know, maybe they've got a history of some kind of activism. Maybe they were squatting or something like that. Anything in the past like that can be another flag. So you end up then with social services looking at essentially a profile of someone where they've got multiple flags, and that person, and that could go in a lot of directions, but at the very minimum, that means that person is more likely, when they're going to apply resources to go knock on someone's door and say, can we just have a look around, or whatever the thing is to check your kids or whatever, right? Yeah. That person, at the absolute minimum, it's a little bit like racial profiling, right? That person, at the absolute minimum, is more likely to get the interaction at the door with this government agency that has the power to take children off you. It's just a fact. Now, that to some people it's like, well, what's the big deal if you haven't done anything wrong? It doesn't matter, you're in that zone. But the simple reality is that if every single parent on planet Earth got a social services officer sat in their living room during the worst moment of the year when the two kids are screaming and you're going through a nervous breakdown, whatever, someone can have a family drama that is just family drama and it's a part of life. And if your worst moments were witnessed, that in itself would be a big flag, and it'd be like, well, maybe we need to interview these kids, and then there could be an inadvertent conversation that's had with those kids that leads to another concern, and it's all hypothetical and it's all very subjective. But before you know it, you've got a person who's completely within the legal frameworks of the chosen country and culture, and morally and ethically, by any normal person's standard, is just being a person living their life, but they are in the zone of being of the exception. They're, and even whether you apply that as a person in your own liberty, the exception, or your children being under threat, that's one example that comes to mind of how people, there's a line at which people are being put in that situation where, like everything I've just laid out there, other than someone who's really other than someone who would say, yeah, I think you should flag those people because they've got an ideological position against all those things I just mentioned. Other than that, a normal citizen would say, like, no, it's not right for that person to get flagged in that way. It's not, that person's being, they're literally, it's a class system at that point, right? That's an interesting conversation where any intelligent person could have that conversation, and this rigorous debate could be had with fruitful results. Everything before that is a little bit polarised, or much easier to be polarised.
What do you mean before that?
Everything higher than that, in the sense of, like there's someone who's got a radical history of radical Islam and whatever, right? So you can say like, okay, maybe this person should be watched. They've actually stated that the West should fall, or whatever, some picky dramatic example. But then when it comes into a point where that person's being targeted, not because of the actual culture and the legal system, they're being targeted because of emergent ideas. Anyone who says vaccines, anyone who's concerned about vaccines is a conspiracy theorist. Anyone who blah, 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 right? So as soon as that, when you get into that zone where what we are as a culture is one thing, but what the general momentum of social and communications and information energy within that melting pot of that society is actually saying some different things to what we are. As we are a country that values free speech, in no way is that exemplified in the way we're actually running this country, in the way that people are interacting with each other in their lives. Most people now are happy to impinge on free, that I speak to, and that it seems from everything you see, most people are happy to say, well, there's limits to free speech. But that's not coherent with what we are as a culture. That transition from that into that, I think, is a really important line, because if people can transition to that point and there not be a big pushback, well, everything else is easy. Because that's the point at which there's no rational basis to not go, holy shit, we need to back off and have a conversation about this. If they can get to that point where they can say, an innocent member of your... It's a little bit like the American thing, like during all the war on terror shit, where as soon as it's like, we admit that we're torturing people. Okay, right. And then everyone just goes back to work again. It's like, why is that not a watershed moment where, it's like, are we the baddies? The old cliche, like of course, we're the baddies in that situation, and there needs to be a conversation. And I think that is where we're not at a level of, like brain dead yet as a culture, where we can easily just deny that. That's why that torture thing was always a really good talking point. So I think that's where the most fruitful conversation is, because that's where you end up with the idea of the exception is being applied in the way, even if you had 500 years of some tyrannical dictatorship now, to the nth degree of whatever totalitarian nightmare you can imagine, at its worst, short of obviously the physical depravity that might go with that, at its worst, it wouldn't be much different to what I'm talking about there, where you've got a law-abiding person who's doing nothing other than have ideas themselves, that is having their life impinged upon, or maybe the way that what they choose to do or how they choose to move, altered by an energy within the culture that makes them rightfully feel, if not afraid or paranoid, concerned, where they might watch what they do or watch what they say or whatever. So I think it is that it's that point where it switches.
And the obvious, this is what slightly gets me with the left as well, because and many people point this out, although it's not really managed to influence sort of current conversations around, say, health passports and the biopolitical surveillance and so on. But it's always those that are discriminated against and those that are excluded in different ways that suffer the consequences of that. Even if it's the people trying to navigate what, up until recently, critical theorists and those on the left in particular were pointing out as kind of the oppressive structures of state power. So if you're a refugee, your access is denied. I mean, I think we spoke about this before. Like I mentioned, there's this concept which I think is really useful called grey spaces. And you talk between the white, bright light of full citizenship and the black dark of extermination. On the right black end of it. The Holocaust
kind of what
or
I mean
whatever.
Social services example.
Yeah, exactly. But actually, what the point of this literature, and it comes from critical urban theory, but some of it comes from like the way in which the informal is in relation to the formal, in terms of, so take like squatting, you gave as an example. That's an informal grassroots or whatever type of habitation that is in the state's relationship to that fluctuates, right? I mean, it's kind of, the laws change somewhat, the squatters' rights, etc., etc. So urban informality in that sense, it's the same in terms of, when favelas sort of develop, or informal housing structures especially in developing countries where they don't actually have those land rights, but they, but they just have nowhere to live, and they build very, shacks and stuff. Yeah, but it's also the case. It's also the case, say, in Palestine, where there's been continuous encroachments on on Palestinian land by Israeli settlers, and those Palestinians have, are in some kind of grey space outside of.
Yeah.
So it's similar to sort of Agamben's exception, but I guess it's
so
less.
by his definition of that by their definition of this grey spaces, concept of grey spaces, would included in that be Palestinians as a good extreme example of But and then would it include all the way down? Does it encompass anyone? Like I was. So anyone who's in a zone where they're being impinged upon, but it's not the black whatever the term you use for the other extreme.
Exactly. So. Yeah, I think the one that I talked about is like, economic migrants, even if they have the right to work, in the UK, the structure is so complex that I think I gave this example before, that a sort of small scale employer would just look at them and look at the papers and be like, it's going to take me 2 days to work through this, and I still might be wrong, and I might be at risk of having a fine. So, cheers, mate. I'll be in touch. I'll let you know. So there's people having to navigate the kind of, it was referred to as like, border control. You think exists at the border, right? But it's actually been privatised, and it links back to what we were saying about the way in which, government actually often uses the private sector to act as police in a sense, in the broad sense of that.
Yeah, and create gradations of border, even once you're in the
gradations
in the community.
Gradations of border and all sorts of variations, because citizenship used to be traditionally the absolute equality of rights amongst a group of Homo sapiens within a political boundary. And it was about the rights between, those people vis-a-vis the state. And now it's been turned into all sorts of different sort of grey spacing gradations of. So
we're just to hold right in it with this concept of grey spaces. It's a viable expression of that to refer to just economic the class system of capitalism. So you're wearing more of a grey space if you're broke than someone who's wealthy within a culture, right? Access to legal structures and all the rest of it. You are definitely more existing with it. All the ways that the West could be proposed to be corrupt or authoritarian. You are massively vulnerable to those. The less money you've got, and almost invulnerable to them the more money you've got.
Yeah.
Is that?
I don't know if you use that, but I guess they do, and I think like intersectionality would come into play then. So you could think of like the people in the Grenfell Tower, like it was predominantly ethnic minorities of different kind. On what different, how many of them were first generation, second generation, how many of them could actually speak, the language really proficiently and understand the norms and the laws and so on. So they end up in positions of the reason I'm saying this is I think it's comparable to your example around homeschooling, and then maybe you've not had one or several vaccines and all these flags that are going. You're being put into a sort of a sort of greater degree of sort of vulnerability in which the sort of in which power may be used against you, even if you've not done anything wrong. It's not paranoid to think.
Yeah, and just importantly as well, like you are exactly what you just said. Plus, there's the self-regulation factor as well. Of even there's a self-policing factor of just you being aware that process is existing, will mean you may or may not go to a protest and think, I can't have another flag. You start thinking in those terms of
which is why I was
it's very much like the idea of the panopticon in a way. Yeah. This functions in a way that it's not necessarily just look, we can identify the way it's working like this. No, it could be not willful, but it could be this concept is a very, very efficient tool of power and the state itself, even if inadvertent, because it causes self-regulation in that panopticon kind of sense.
And you can move that then like to the social credit system, because obviously that's the ideal. And
it's just the evolution of that.
One of the things like I've been sort of reading about and thinking about at the moment is the different types of power and the different types of resistance to that. And so Foucault, for example, talked about sovereign power, disciplinary power and biopolitical power.
How do you define sovereign power?
Mainly through sort of law and the enforcement of law by police services, like rights and the erosions of rights. So it's more the kind of...
So it's more the evolved framework legally type of thing.
Yeah, and in those situations where you normally see resistance is in sort of more formal, confrontational, the power of the state versus, forms of social movement or resistance movements, and it's kind of the more obvious. I guess it's probably the space that most people would sort of think about it.
And it's going on within the sphere as ordained by the system itself. So it's like within the legal framework kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, but then disciplinary power is more about, the Panopticon is an example of that. So it's more about the way in which the school system works, or the prison system works, or the whereby it's Panopticon is like the major metaphor for it. But yeah, it's the way in which I guess norms are created and people then are subjectivized by those norms, and there's different architectural and disciplinary mechanisms for doing that, forms of regulation, training, disciplining, etc. And that's also linked to forms of knowledge. So if you take the example you were giving, like social work in and of itself, is based on a set of kind of, like Foucault talks about sort of knowledge power. So it's kind of certain truth claims that are actually, constructed in a important sense, and certainly are, you could compare them between different historical periods and just say, yeah, this wouldn't even make sense in this. Yeah. So he referred to them as epistemes, like, which is more like the kind of underpinnings under which sort of different knowledge claims could even be conceivable. And so, yeah, you get all the discipline, psychiatry, sort of the things that inform social work, probably the stuff that you've talked about in terms of, educational regimes and, things within the prison system, like, I forgot the name, but, about reforming character. That didn't used to be the case. It used to be just like punishment. Yeah, you've infracted. It wasn't about
a deterrent.
It wasn't a science of the soul, if you like. It wasn't about kind of, actually how do we understand what's going on? How do we understand deviance and criminology? And then how do we kind of mobilize these tools in order to reform these characters within some kind of normative structure? So that's kind of disciplinary power, and there's obviously all sorts of forms of resistance to that in people's just daily lives, like not in mass forms. And then there's the kind of biopolitical, which is more about populations. So it's about how populations and statistics about populations, and I think now in particular, like, AI and digital, because, like you said with the red flagging, they're not about individual bodies per se. It's not like being disciplined in the barracks or in the classroom or whatever. They're about statistical correlations and then identifications of certain norms about public health or about whatever, and how then and it's not only state power then. I think this is happening across private sector, even with sort of insurance policies. They're looking at population dynamics and how if you live in this area and you've got this certain characteristic and etc., then, and you don't really know where these, you just get them, the cost of the insurance or whatever.
Yeah.
But, it's happening across the board. And I think in the sort of security profiling sort of stuff as well, it's bringing all these different data points together to create maps in a way that are not individualized. They are, they're abstract, but they create risk environments that then can be acted upon by different institutional sort of sources.
Absolutely.
And so resistance there, it's funny because I was looking at the biopolitical one, and they were talking about different types of resistance, and they actually brought up like different communities that were kind of this is just in a sort of, not a textbook, but yeah, it was a kind of deep introduction, if you like, to these ideas. People who were sort of homeschooling was one example of resistance to biopolitical, because, I guess the education system is a form of, biopolitical power. These are not mutually exclusive. So obviously disciplinary power operates within a specific, classroom or, site, Whereas probably more broadly, the educational system is more of a sort of biopolitical, you know, you're looking at the different statistical rates of, you know, educational attainment and how they link into economy and job creation, and, you know, it's all that kind of stuff. But yeah, they mentioned sort of vaccine, they mentioned homeschooling. And just to pull this back to the COVID thing, and then I'll kind of pause, but you know, one of the things I was wondering is to what extent can you see some of this resistance, and this sort of links into that Paul Kingsnorth, yeah, whereby, just to remind us both,
Confessions of a
Recovering Environmentalist,
yeah,
something like that. But the more recent, those 3 essays he did on COVID, and you know,
the barcode moment. Talked about it before.
Yeah, we talked about it before, but basically the fact that what appears to be sort of, you know, vaccine-free or anti-lockdown movements, he hypothesizes that actually underpinning that is a resistance to what he calls the machine, and that actually it's, and that's why I think, you know, it's probably not obviously fully conceptualized in every individual's mind that's involved in that, but I think there's a general kind of resistance to, you know, biopolitical tattooing, you know, to this kind of further encroachment of these forms of power and control, that this is just the most immediate and kind of most visceral and pronounced example
there's got to be
that.
There's got to be an element of something. A front line, if you like, emerges in, for simplicity's sake, the war against the machine. Referring, whether that's I think that's why I got interested in him. Actually, he's talking there essentially about what I talk about in terms of everything since agriculture, and just the sort of fusion between the relationship between technology and human frailty that makes us do everything that we do and create sort of the political dynamics that we're talking about. And it's lots of people have sort of pointed to this machine, like Philip K. Dick called it the black iron prison, like that you can find really similar, like overlapping templates that people have used to point to this vague collection of power and interest, right? Not interest, but you know. He's talking about the machine, and he's this so people have got an inherent aversion to it, because the machine, above all, what it's doing is it's reducing your sovereignty in order for it to gain an advantage, like in the simplest possible terms. That's what it's basic monkey versus monkey logic, right? It's just that they've got a lot more influence, or the machine has a lot more influence, whether it doesn't have to be will implied in it.
But there's some people doing better out of the machine. I think that's probably
absolutely,
a good way of putting it, right?
Yeah,
so it's not like, they're doing it. There's non-human forces at work here,
exactly.
for sure. But there's those that are...
Yeah, and when everyone, it's a good unifying flag, if you like, to stand under, that almost everyone I know recognizes the machine in some way that metaphorically that they understand, even if it's just the tax system, whatever it is. Like, everyone's got at some point in their life they've got a war. They have their own battle with the machine in some way. And if you speak to them on that basis, there's a lot of common ground there that people can suddenly get, and it's whether it's anti-statism or whatever it is. Everyone's in that battle to some degree, and sometimes the battle that you're in isn't at the forefront of people's consciousness and attention, right? So you could not give a shit about vaccines or homeschooling, but you recognise that in the current era that you're in, a lot of people are mobilised about this specific issue that itself represents a conflict with the machine. And even if you're not into it, people shift over into it. So you can get people talking about supporting and getting engaged in the vaccine thing, but it's not necessarily their thing. It's just that it's a good it's the front line in the battle that you choose to move over to support that dynamic is the simple, and that's why I think it's important to strip it down to its core thing, which is sovereignty. It's always
And I think that's why legitimately and without any disingenuity, there's so many people that have been vaccinated and that are part of those movements because they're like, this is not about my choice.
I'm down for this, but people get to decide. That's the issue.
And those encroachments. I was going to say something, but I forgot. What were you saying just before that? Oh yeah, okay. So linked to that, right? I one of the things I was thinking about is that we're all we're attempting to kind of describe this fairly ineffable thing. That guy is just referred to as a machine. When you're trying to approach an extraordinarily complex reality, you try to map it. You've got some concepts. You try to
mythologize it even.
Mythologize it. Well, that's where I'm going actually. Yeah. But ours is going to be pretty. It's not. It's going to be. There's going to be a degree of resolution, but it's not high resolution, right? We've not been studying this in great detail and trying to really kind of develop that map like people do in different areas. But and then people are at different spaces, I guess, in terms of how high a resolution is it and how accurately does that actually map onto reality. And obviously, no one's got the accurate map, and there's all sorts of different perspectives, and there's different sort of lenses being put onto things and so on. Yeah. And that's kind of the challenge of sort of, I guess, epistemology or something. But at the level of I think there's an interesting way to think about some of the things that are being depicted as conspiracy theory, right? So just to take the most common one, right? Bill Gates is, controls the world and he's trying to take it over or whatever. Now, you can fact check that, right? No, Bill Gates doesn't control the world. There's obviously governments and there's, and you can make, whatever, right? But it's like the mythology thing, right? And it's like the fact that actually fiction can point towards truths that are actually much more, they're hard to identify and they're much more complex. Terms. So what are those people saying? Like, I don't know, I'd be interested to find out. But, you can easily think, that they feel completely disempowered by the existing political system, that there are elites that are operating, outside of democratic process of government that predominantly operate at a national level that are being superseded, that inequalities in wealth are meaning that those individuals and groups of individuals are able to, through Davos and all these other forums, consolidate particular visions for the future which align with their interests and incentives, and that will presumably make them even more wealthy. That those individuals are also now in a relationship with and arguably on parity, if not overriding, certain institutions that were supposed to be bounded by more democratic processes like the UN, the World Health Organization. Bill Gates is the second largest donor. So, and we could keep going, and you wrap within that a kind of sense that this is technocratic, which it, by definition is. It's there are elements of our world that are democratic, and there are elements that are more technocratic, and it's surely a sliding scale again, and there are different mosaics and patchworks. But that's just me in 2 minutes, kind of trying to sort of complicate that thing. But when there's an image, for example, of Bill Gates going ha ha ha, whatever, you can say these, but that's the use of image, myth, narrative, albeit simplifications, and yes, perhaps there's people at different levels of complexity, but are they more ignorant or than someone else who may be more articulate and sophisticated, but is just totally dismissing that, and then essentially falls into, let's just say, the consensus narrative, broadly speaking. I know there's not just one narrative and all the rest of it. Let's just say, I would suggest that if some I'm not predicting the future here, but I think you could look back in 40 years and say, actually, these people, were intuitively and in substance, the details might not be right. They might not, they might have a very low resolution, if you like, but the sort of kernel of truth that they were getting at was a very important kernel of truth and reflected, real social conditions and real trajectories and trends. So it comes to that Peterson point about myth and story, and the fact that, or the Jungian point, the fact that, humans have always created stories that are not true in a let's check the facts of that. They are, they create villains, they create gods, they create, these things that are not true, but convey a truth, true enough, and give orient them towards their social reality. And I kind of think there's something about this kind of, I'm not saying this is the case in all sort of the conspiracy stuff, because clearly there's loads of nonsense, but I suspect that, as we, in terms of what we're saying with that Paul King's North, that there is, if you were to sort of survey or engage with and maybe sort of, more ethnographically sort of study these groups, I think that would be a sort of common pattern that's coming out, even if they've not fully made that conscious to themselves. It's that sense of surveillance, of biopolitical tattooing, of this machine, of this technocracy, etc., etc. And just because that then comes out in a sort of very crude and sort of inaccurate in a technical sense, or Bill Gates, that's just a way of understanding that.
Two things connected to that I wanted to say. First thing is, when you talked about looking back historically, looking back in the future, and saying that you usually find that those people had grievances, had real concerns, and with the appropriate amount of distance, you can see that there's usually something to a lot of what.
Yeah, they might have had a better orientation to the present
than the present culture thought they did, and better than the standard narrative.
Yeah. A really, really simple reasoning behind that is, if you were going to choose one metric by which to qualify someone in a given era, to qualify them in being likely to be speaking the truth, you probably couldn't do much better than finding the degree to which their needs and advertised objectives are counter to established power. Like, if there's an established power in any era, probably, it's a fairly safe thing to say that established power is going to be creating a narrative that suits its own needs. I don't care if this is a slightly one ape with slightly bigger biceps than another ape. If there's one human system with more influence than another human system sharing the same system, it's not a certainty, but it's a pretty safe bet to say that the more powerful one is going to create a certain narrative that suits its ends, and it instantly, by extension, follows from that the narrative expressed by the weaker component in that system is likely to be truer, because it's going to be counter to that inherently flawed or twisted or manipulated narrative. So it's going to be counter. There is not a lot of agenda for this structure to lie about this structure. There is in the other direction, and that in the simplest possible terms, that's the reason why you could apply that historically to say, if you're in a time machine, you just land in any time, you're like, I want to find the people who are talking the most sense. Find the class or the group of people that are most in the crosshairs of established power, while having the ability to communicate thoughtfully about it, right? Yeah.
So I think that's the first thing.
Can I just add something to that before we go on? I know that, I know you were purposely kind of making that simple, obviously, and you said the system and the other system, and I think that's the case, isn't it, right? Because power's emanating from multiple sources. We're not just saying it's coming from the
there's disparities everywhere, including me to my staff at work for me. There's always disparities, and that's just a fact. There are power relationships.
There's those disciplinary forms of power. There's those sovereign forms of power. And they're all in it. But and the other thing I just wanted to add to that is not only about if you wanted to go and listen to the articulations of those two powers by the individuals that are on the receiving end of it, which is definitely true. A corollary to that is, I think if you want to understand power, you have to look at what the resistance to that is, because it's almost like
the resistance to power, or the resistance to the resistance.
Well, the resistance to power, because I just think something. If you take Brave New World thing, right? The idea being power becomes invisible. Arguably not even power. I mean, I don't know where I'm going with this in a way, but when it's so complete, which is what Huxley was sort of saying. I mean, I don't know. You might just say that's just but so only in the moments of resistance to that can you actually sort of, I think, I think they both are needed in order to understand in what way is this power, how is it, because there has to be some kind of will or agency, like. Well, that's it.
I think it's important to add to that the point at which that Brave New World idea that the power transitions into being hidden power, as in, which really to make that sound a little bit less triggering. Power identifies that its ends are better served by not being completely upfront, not demonstrating and advertising everything it's doing, which is the simple. I mean, all I'm saying is the point at which that happens in any dynamic. I'm not talking about the government versus the poor working class. I'm talking that could be in a community of people, in a tribe, with a certain different people playing roles in the tribal situation. I'm just talking about the dynamics of power, not even the vulnerabilities of humanity. I just mean people who, by whatever nature in a given sphere, have more power than others. In a physical sphere, a big meathead dude is going to have more power than a skinny little dude. Like that's just. I just mean the facts of power.
But I think that has to be complexified in that. I mean, I think it's useful to sort of show that trajectory and use anthropomorphize, that, in terms of, this group and that group. But, I think you'd agree, like if you take ideology as a concept, it's like actually those in power are equally enthralled and sort of unaware of the very power relations. So it's not necessarily, I guess, a sort of agentive thing. I mean, it is in different spaces.
But all I'm saying, that's all I mean with the Brave New World type thing. I was just gonna. It's just a quick addition to what you're saying to say that I think it's a provable. It's an extremely strong hypothesis that anything existing in a relationship of power to a subordinate or superordinate power, even the person on the lower end of this. If you're in a power disparity, asymmetry with another structure, there is a point at which you realise that withholding as much information as you can is in your interests, right? Either on the receiving end or top, right, whichever, right? All I'm saying is I think that it's the simplest observation, this, but it's so powerful. The point at which that occurs, and you either being on the bottom or the top of that dynamic, realise that you need to withhold as much information as possible to increase your power. The point at which that realisation is made is extremely early in the process. Like it's the dumbest, it's the simplest possible observation to make. Like, oh, I might not want to tell that guy I've got that big club stashed behind the tree, right? It's almost like a very primitive hominid would have that shit down, right? So we could take that as a fact, right? If you extrapolate that up then to political systems, and the fact that we have an aversion to assume that secrecy and hiding as much of the cards, as many of the cards on the table as possible, would be the MO from the get-go. Inherent to that is the entire idea of conspiratorial thinking, and because the only counter that power would have, the only counter that one, and let's not even say power, let's turn it to get rid of the trigger, and let's say it's the little guy trying to get a hand up against the big guy, right?
Yeah, which they do obviously. Like,
of course they do. Yeah, these dynamics are shifting, and sometimes they're winning, and it switches backwards
they try
and
not to pay the taxes, or they try and they hide the fact that they're doing that.
Exactly. They hide. Yeah, exactly. In that situation, where in that situation of that dynamic, you have the counter on the opposite side to that. The only counter, I'd argue, other than direct force, the counter is to undermine that. Trying to get the right words. I need to make it a concrete example to make it make sense. The shifting it back to and putting the crosshairs on power again, because it's just easier, right? If power is any expression of power is from the almost get-go, is going to be being very careful with its information and what it presents to you so that it can have the maximum amount of control. Your single best defense against that is to try and bring that stuff into the open, bring that information into the open. The little guy's defense is to bring that stuff into the open. Shifting the chess game back to power, then in response to that, what is undeniably, there's only two responses to that. One, physical force, shut up, stop saying what you're saying. And number two, question the veracity of what's being said. What could be a better way of doing that than the entire concept of conspiracy theory? And the idea that what they're saying is ridiculous, right? That is, what I'm trying to get at here is that you've got sequences of facts. I would argue a fact. Power would do this. We both would do this. We would both do this. The response would be, no, bring this information into the open. And then there's no better response on the other side than direct force or pulling down the veracity of that information. Yeah. So you would expect to see in existence in any reasonably significantly asymmetric power relationship, you would expect to see that the key narrative coming from the most powerful structure in that dynamic would be, what you're talking about, and it would be diminishing any idea of authoritarianism in that power. That's just, and I think you can fairly cleanly say that that's a fact. You would expect to see that. Yeah. Would you definitely see that? Maybe not, but you could expect to see it, and it's very likely that it would emerge.
And of course, there's a struggle around that, isn't there? So, I mean, like take the JFK thing as an example, because maybe it's a less heated example because it's in the fairly distant future now. People had serious questions with the official narrative that was presented. It was just incongruous. It was there's the whole magic bullet theory. Anyone can go and look it up, right? So what you're faced then with is the fact that the official narrative just doesn't stack up. You would have to have such credulity to accept that, or you just not bothered, whatever. And then when people have tried to sort of challenge that, then the actual CIA developed or amplified the use of the term conspiracy theory. Amplified the use of the term conspiracy, and that's well documented, and not just in the US, but they did it sort of globally.
It is just for dotting the I's. I think it is. You'll find people questioning that memo and the degree to which they were saying this, we're going to use this term. Yeah, it's still a conversation, but I think to be completely factual, what can't be denied is that the term being used in that sense was definitely it was used in the interests of silence and dissent, and there was an agreed upon sort of almost formalized understanding that the term was a benefit to power in that way.
And then, I mean, I don't want to dwell on this really, but recently, was it, I think, Trump first, and then maybe even Biden now as well. There was supposed to be, because who's the guy who did the original film and then subsequently did a documentary? Oliver Stone, right? So I don't know if you've seen the...
I haven't seen the documentary.
Yeah, I've seen it actually.
Oh, really?
It's good. So he's done the follow-up only about a year ago.
I think he was answering any critiques that people have raised against the film, which is hilarious. They were raising critiques against a drama. Like he did. You've got to train an hour and a half. You've got to take some liberties. And combining characters and stuff.
Yeah, but also to bring it up to date with the additional information that's been sort of, acknowledged, released, whatever, subsequent to that. But they've still not released certain key piece of information. It was supposed to have come
50 years, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was supposed to have come, and I think it was, I don't know if it's Trump or Biden, but anyway, it might have even been both of them that have just kicked the can down the road. So that just come back to your point around the transparency thing, right? Mm-hmm. There are those saying, there are those forces trying to make something more transparent, and then those try to hide it. And just the other obvious thing to add to this, but we could go into much more detail, and it links back to all the stuff we've talked about the exception and all that, is that security is the justification always. So the battle between democracy and security is extremely profound, because, 4 reasons of security are used.
Legitimate reasons, even, because it's a warranted conversation. Like you can see, it's very justified to say for that paternalistic power to say, I'm protecting you. You can't handle this information, even.
Yeah, or others will find out about it. It'll it'll undermine our standing
our security and standing.
But nevertheless, people, citizens, whatever. Then there needs to be a recognition that to the extent that is the case, really does undermine the extent to which you can call it a democracy, because the major most
whether
important,
you can call it a democracy,
the major most important, most consequential aspects of decision making and accountability and so on are removed from view. And the stuff that Snowden revealed and all this kind of security architecture and all within critical security studies there's a sort of school of thought or a field called securitization, and it sort of links to Agamben. It's a little bit different, but basically it uses speech act theory, and it talks about how people in positions of power are constantly aiming...
Speech act theory is.
Yeah, so in other words, speech is not just linguistic, it brings things into reality, it has material consequences. Mm-hmm. That's a simple, nothing profound about it really. But the point is that they refer to it as a speech act and a referent object. So what can be classed as a security threat? COVID, right? Should that be managed through other discursive channels, public health, and has public health been securitized? Which it sort of increasingly has, and you can do it sort of, you can track the ways in which it has and the documentations. Like one emblem of that is the fact that what used to be Public Health England is now called, I think it's the Health and Security Agency or something. And
I'm living in Orwell.
Yeah, these are, and this is about referring to things as threats to either the state or to the population. It's about creating an existential threat, and that's why it sort of links to what Agamben's saying, because once this is actually an existential threat, we can pull it out of the political domain where there's debate and argument and slow processes of deliberative democratic process, and into this is a threat. There's not really anything we can't do to deal with this threat, and also we can't really tell you about it because there's things we have to keep secret. And I think there's no doubt now that the other big securitizing thing now is speech. Like, speech is being securitized. That is what mis and disinformation is doing now. That's not to deny that we do live in an age of information, and that there is information warfare. So even that term information warfare is security right based, it's war. Yeah. But how, whatever one's view on that, I think the one explanation for the way in which the media has responded is this, there will be so many conferences and trainings for journalists and so on about the way in which information is being weaponized. So they will be thinking, well, if we publish this or discuss this, the anti-vaxxers are going to use this, and actually many of the anti-vaxxers are Russian bots that are trying to kind of undermine vaccine uptake, because that will then lead us to, mean that we can't reopen the economy, and it'll, and of course, I mean, we've talked about how China, that ridiculous footage that came out of China that some in the media perpetuate, where people falling dead on the street, and then everyone learns that that's not what happens with this virus, right? So that's clearly made up. So there is all that going on, but yeah, that's what's kind of, I'm not prescribing any solutions necessarily, although I obviously have views on these things, but this is what people have to these are, I think, some of the frameworks that people have to kind of think about what's going on, because once that's moved into the security sphere, then, there are, it's no longer, these spheres no longer are democratically managed. No. They are managed through a completely different lens, and at a certain point we will be at risk in saying this is no longer a democracy, and then what's the point? It comes back to the whole security liberty thing.
And I think the thing that under all of it, the thing that potentiates it more than anything from the people up is just the willingness that people now, it's more like during all the Bush era, it's insane that we're only talking like 20 years, 15 years.
Yeah.
A lot of people that would have never believed I could hear as many people as I hear now saying, if not saying, but just demonstrating in the way they're choosing to conduct their lives and the attention they choose to put on or ignore or put off certain things, that there's some, it's like it's got so complicated now with the, like you were just saying there about to use that Russian example of allowing a certain area of disinformation to grow so that the economy could be restricted, right? I think a lot of people, as soon as the world is at a level of complexity now where a lot of people see that level of complexity and justifiably just shrink from it and just say, intelligent people, because they're intelligent, look at that situation and say, how can I understand or comment on this? And it just completely ferments this passing over sovereignty to the strong leader kind of thing.
Yeah.
And legitimately, and it's almost like
legitimately,
it uses intelligent, appropriate civic responsibility. It's like it's turning that against people, because the only people who could be in opposition to that level, to the system, to the order, to the state within that level of complexity would have to be a moron that thinks they know better than all these, the professionals and all the rest of it.
And it makes you as well acknowledge that also those people in those more technocratic spheres of power, and of course it's gradated all the way. It's explicable. It's not. They also. It's not. It's not like there's a necessary malign intent or whatever. It's like, so how can within this level of complexity, how can democratic institutions function? Do we not? Is not technocracy the kind of?
Well, and I think it's highly. It's interesting that all of that leads to, in any intelligent discussion that's depolarized and not ideological, the result would always have to be, it massively pushes technocracy forward as being the only valid form of governance from now on, because for all the same reason, and any intelligent approach to it, you're forced to either say, I as the individual citizen can understand these levels of complexity, and therefore I should have a democratic power over it. You'd have to be able to say that, and it's not true. The closest you can come to maintaining that position is saying, I don't care if the world isn't going to be as ordered a place as a result of me keeping that democratic power. It's better that half the world dies than the individual loses democratic power. And there's an ethical basis for making that point. It's just a very difficult one to make. But to come back to what I was just quickly going to say about that, what I think's underneath it all, people do have the way you watch 1984 20 years ago, and you see the people, and it's very easy to see who you are in that film, who you're supposed to relate to, and then these other people that are so completely homogenized into this collective intent, right, that's been administered downward to them, right? It was a joke It was almost cartoony, 1984, in that way. It's like no one, I could never conceive of someone being able to be that closed off, and we're all with Winston kind of thing. Whereas now there is definitely a clear and identifiable momentum of people being happy to be that guy. I can't remember the guy's name, the character's name in it, but his neighbour who's just like the cliche of kind of going along, right? And they all are. That's the point of the film, the book. But now people are actually doing that, and the trick is, when you were assessing that before, you'd almost said you could never get this degree of control over people, because you were expecting that what would happen is the state would tell them something and they'd respond by becoming like that, and that's not what's happened. What's happened is the level of this complexity that we're talking about has created a situation where, whether consciously or subconsciously, it's the intelligent response to act like those collectivist serfs, if you like, right? And that's horrifying, and that you can see that now. You can see people I know extremely liberal people who've moved in some very, alternative circles where they've had real skin in the game, skin in the classically liberal game, sort of, questioning and correcting power and increasing sovereignty of the individual and whatnot. And these people are kind of, there's a bit of an apathy there now where it's like, and it's an aware apathy. I'm not saying they're brain dead. It's an aware apathy of the same principles that would have had me act the way I acted to try and limit power. Now those same principles impose upon me the sort of the intelligent response of becoming like that guy in 1984 and being homogenizing it to this sort of collective viewpoint. That surely is the ultimate watershed, horrifying moment, because what the hell do you do to compete with that? What would you do to correct that or whatever?